I was 63 years old when I realized loneliness does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters quietly, disguised as routine, hidden inside ordinary mornings and familiar conversations. For most of my adult life, I considered myself fortunate. I had been married to my husband Daniel for over 30 years. We raised 2 children who eventually moved away and built lives of their own. I spent my days working part-time at a small community bookstore near downtown, recommending novels to strangers. My evenings were predictable. I watered the flowers in the backyard, folded laundry while old sitcoms played, and sat beside my husband on the couch while he watched documentaries he had already seen 3 times before. Nothing about my life was dramatic. I used to believe that was the definition of happiness: stability, quiet, safety. But somewhere along the way I stopped feeling visible inside my own existence, and I did not even realize it until another man noticed me. It started during a rainy afternoon after a business fundraiser hosted at a hotel across town. Near the end of the evening, one of Daniel's longtime colleagues offered to drive me home. His name was Richard Halle. He was tall, composed, with silver hair and the kind of calm voice that made people instinctively listen. I had known him casually for years, but we had never spent time alone together. The rain fell steadily as we drove through quiet streets glowing beneath streetlights. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a slow rhythm while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. At first we spoke about ordinary things, the terrible catering, how quickly the year had passed. But after a while the conversation changed without warning. There was a long silence between us. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Then he glanced at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road and said, "You seem like someone who spends a lot of time taking care of everyone else." I laughed softly because it sounded harmless enough. "I suppose that's what most women my age do," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but sometimes people become so dependable that everyone forgets they need care too." His words unsettled me more than they should have. I turned toward the window so he would not notice the sudden emotion crossing my face. Outside, rain blurred the neighborhoods into streaks of gray and gold. I tried to brush off the strange heaviness growing in my chest, but then he asked another question. "Do you ever feel like people stopped really seeing you?" The air inside the car suddenly felt smaller. I should have laughed or changed the subject, but instead I sat there silently, because the truth had already answered for me. After years of being a wife, a mother, the reliable woman who remembered birthdays, I could not remember the last time someone looked at me as if I existed beyond my responsibilities. Richard did not flirt. That somehow made it worse. There was no arrogance in his tone, no manipulation, only sincerity. When we finally reached my driveway, the rain had stopped, leaving water dripping from the trees overhead. I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape the strange tension. But before I stepped out, he spoke again, quietly this time. "Daniel is lucky to come home to someone like you." I froze. The comment was simple, yet something about the way he said it made my pulse stumble. Not because it sounded romantic, but because it sounded honest. I went inside feeling shaken in a way I could not explain. That night, my husband fell asleep quickly beside me while I stared at the ceiling, replaying every word from that drive. I kept asking myself why it affected me so deeply. It was not attraction, not yet anyway. It was recognition. Someone had looked directly at me after years of feeling emotionally blurred into the background. Over the following days, I tried to forget about it and return to normal life. I cleaned the kitchen, stocked groceries, answered phone calls from my daughter, and listened to Daniel complain about taxes and plumbing repairs. Everything appeared exactly the same, yet internally something had shifted. Then Richard texted me. The message was polite and brief. "I hope I didn't overstep the other day." That wasn't my intention. I stared at the words for several minutes before responding. "You didn't. I just wasn't expecting honesty." He replied almost immediately. "Neither was I." That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. A week later, Daniel mentioned that Richard was hosting a small dinner gathering at his house and suggested we attend together. I agreed too quickly. The evening itself was ordinary on the surface. Several couples from the office gathered around the dining table. Richard moved through the room with quiet confidence, making sure everyone felt welcome. Yet, every now and then I caught him watching me from across the room, not intensely, not possessively, simply attentively. Late in the evening, I stepped outside onto the back patio to get some air. The garden lights cast soft shadows. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the cool night air when I heard the sliding door open behind me. Richard stepped outside and stood beside me, leaving respectful distance between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "You look sad tonight." I laughed under my breath. "That obvious?" He looked toward the yard before answering. "Only to someone who understands the feeling." There was something fragile in his voice that made me finally ask about his late wife. He spoke quietly about losing her several years earlier and how silence had consumed the house afterward. He described waking up expecting to hear another person breathing beside him before remembering she was gone. As he talked, I realized how long it had been since I heard someone speak honestly about emotional emptiness. Most people our age avoided conversations like that. We talked about medications, weather, grandchildren, politics, anything except loneliness. Eventually he turned toward me gently and said, "I think you've spent so much time being dependable that nobody notices how tired you are." The words hit me harder than I expected. Tears stung my eyes immediately, embarrassing and sudden. I looked away, ashamed. He never touched me. He never crossed the line physically. But emotional intimacy can be far more dangerous than touch. Over the next month, we began seeing each other accidentally on purpose. A conversation in the grocery store turned into coffee. Coffee became long walks beside the lake discussing regret, aging, marriage, and the strange grief of becoming invisible. Every interaction felt innocent individually, yet together they formed something undeniably intimate. Richard listened carefully whenever I spoke, as though my thoughts mattered. I found myself telling him things I had never admitted aloud. How exhausted I felt pretending contentment all the time. How much of myself I had quietly abandoned over the years. One afternoon, while rain tapped softly against cafe windows, he asked me, "When was the last time someone asked what you wanted?" I could not answer because I genuinely did not know. Somewhere between raising children and maintaining stability, I stopped viewing myself as a person with desires. I became useful instead, predictable, responsible, safe. Richard made me remember there was once more to me than that. The terrifying part was how quickly emotional connection became addictive. I began waiting for his messages. I checked my phone too often. I started lying to Daniel about errands just to spend another hour sitting across from Richard in quiet conversation. Nothing physical happened between us, yet guilt settled heavily over me because emotionally I knew I was drifting somewhere dangerous. One morning, Richard invited me to meet him at a small cafe near the water outside town. I almost declined. Instead, I found myself driving there with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. When I arrived, he was already seated by the window with 2 coffees waiting on the table. The morning sunlight reflected across the lake. We spent hours talking about everything people usually bury deep inside themselves. Fear of aging, regret, missed opportunities. The ache of realizing life became smaller than expected. At one point, he looked directly at me and said, "You deserve to exist as more than someone everyone depends on." Hearing that nearly broke me because I realized how starved I had become for emotional acknowledgement. When we finally walked outside to the parking lot, the wind moved through the trees around us while silence stretched between us again. I looked at him and understood with sudden painful clarity that we were standing at the edge of something irreversible. He stepped slightly closer, still careful not to touch me. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly. I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to go home and forget all of it. But another part of me, the buried, lonely part I had ignored for years, did not want to disappear again. I whispered, "I don't know how." The honesty in those words frightened me. Richard closed his eyes briefly like the answer hurt him too. Then he nodded slowly. "Neither do I?" I drove home afterward with tears sliding silently down my face because I finally understood the danger was never really about romance. It was about emotional hunger. About what happens when 2 lonely people recognize themselves in each other. That evening, Daniel sat beside me on the porch talking about replacing the backyard fence while sunset colored the sky orange and gold. I watched his familiar face, the man who had shared decades of life with me, and suddenly I felt overwhelming grief. Not because I stopped loving him, but because somewhere over the years we had both stopped truly looking at each other. Marriage had become maintenance, routine, survival. I reached for his hand unexpectedly and asked, "Do you think people can disappear slowly?" He frowned slightly, confused by the question. Then after a long silence, he squeezed my fingers gently and answered, "I'd notice if you disappeared." The sincerity in his voice shattered something inside me because I realized maybe he had been lonely too. Maybe we both had. That night, I lay awake thinking about the woman I used to be before responsibility consumed every corner of my identity. I thought about Richard standing quietly beside a lake looking at me as though I still mattered. I thought about my husband sitting beside me for decades, assuming I would always remain exactly the same. And somewhere between those thoughts I finally understood the real mistake was not emotional temptation itself. The mistake was waiting so many years to admit that I had needs beyond being useful to everyone else. Because loneliness ignored long enough will eventually accept recognition from anywhere it appears, even places capable of destroying everything you once believed was enough.